Let's start with introducing you to the pineal gland and two important neurotransmitters, serotonin and melatonin. Let's start with the word pineal or pineal. Both pronunciations are correct. Pineal or pineal meaning pine cone shape. The pineal gland, it looks just like a pine cone. There's no coincidence that it's called pine cone shaped. Now the pineal gland is a tiny little gland, a little bigger than the size of a grain of rice. It's right between the back of your throat and the back of your head. And it's important to know exactly where it is, because when we begin to practice activating the pineal gland, you're going to have to become aware of where it exists and put your attention on it. And where you place your attention is where you place your energy. And the more you pay attention to it, the more you become aware of it, the more you stay present with it, the more you begin to put energy to begin to activate it. The pineal gland is very sensitive to visible light. Light that's coming from the sun or light that's coming from lights that we have in our homes or in our offices. That wavelength of light. Once light is perceived when our eyes are open, the frequency of light is picked up by the optic nerve, and it sends a signal right to a nucleus in the brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. That nucleus signals the sympathetic nervous system, which signals the pineal gland, and the pineal gland gets busy making a neurotransmitter called serotonin. And serotonin is the daytime neurotransmitter that, once activated, begins to cause us to become aware that we're local in space and time, and we become conscious that we're our bodies in an environment and in time. And it produces a certain brainwave frequency called beta brainwave frequencies. It is beta brainwaves that causes us to put most of our attention on the outer world. Now, the release of serotonin then gets us up and gets us busy during the day. This graphic represents that small frequency of visible light that exists in the entire electromagnetic spectrum, and is that tiny little sliver of all of reality that our eyes and our senses are the most sensitive to. When there's an inhibition of light, or there's a lack of light, the lack of the wavelength of light that usually hits the back of the eye, the optic nerve, begins to diminish the release of serotonin in the brain. And so the inhibition of light signals the same nucleus in the brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which then dampens down the sympathetic nervous system, and now the pineal gland begins to make a chemical called melatonin. And melatonin is the nighttime neurotransmitter. And as melatonin levels begin to rise because of darkness in the evening, then all of a sudden we begin to slow our brain waves down into alpha and theta and ultimately delta. And it's melatonin then that allows our body to restore and regenerate. So serotonin gets us up in the morning, and melatonin puts us to bed at night. And those are two important neurotransmitters that function in a rhythm called the circadian rhythm. And when you live in a certain environment, in a certain place in the world, and as the sun comes up and the sun goes down, your brain chemistry becomes entrained to light. Melatonin levels are at their highest during a 24-hour cycle between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m. And that's important for you to know, because when we do the meditation to activate this ancient gland in the back of the brain, it's always important to know that it's a good idea to wake up early enough when the raw materials are at their height. Melatonin levels tend to go down as stress hormone levels go up. And that is a very, very adaptive function over thousands of years of trial and error in an environment. So when there's a stressful event, a dangerous event, when there's a perception of something threatening in the environment, we turn on the stress hormones, the fight or flight nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system, and now we're prepared for danger. So as long as we're perceiving a threat in the outer world, it makes sense then it's not a good idea to go to sleep, because sleeping means you would be more vulnerable and possibly prey. So as melatonin levels go down, as stress hormones go up, our sleep patterns are interrupted because the very raw material that causes us to sleep is diminished. Now, as stress levels go down and we're out of survival, out of emergency mode, then melatonin levels go up and the body can restore, regenerate, and repair. Now, melatonin, the research on it has been profoundly interesting because there's so many important biological processes that melatonin is involved in. Melatonin promotes DNA repair and replication. It stops cortisol oversecretion in response to stress. In other words, if your melatonin levels begin to go up, your stress hormone levels go down, and a little administration or a little addition of melatonin sometimes is enough to jumpstart us to move into restorative sleep. It also improved carbohydrate metabolism. Now, this is an interesting concept because in antiquity, when we were stressed or living in survival, many times it meant famine or the lack of food. So when the survival gene is switched on, all of a sudden now the body's going to take carbohydrates and store them as fats so that we have a reserve of energy in the body. So people who are constantly under stress always are taking carbohydrates and storing them as fats. Melatonin tends to break that cycle. It lowers triglyceride levels. It inhibited atherosclerosis or hardening of the arteries. It heightens both cellular and metabolic immune responses. It decreased certain tumor developments in laboratory animals. In certain laboratory animals, it increased lifespan by 25%. It has a very important neuroprotective role in the brain. It increases REM sleep. It is an important free radical scavenger and antioxidant. Now, antioxidant means anti-cancer, anti-aging, anti-heart disease, anti-stroke, anti-neurodegenerative, anti-inflammatory, antimicrobial. Now, I want you to remember these important points about melatonin because melatonin is essential for our bodies to repair and regenerate. This is the ancient symbol from the Egyptian culture called the Eye of Horus. Next to it, this is what's called a sagittal section of the brain. Now, if you took the two halves of the brain and you divided them right down the middle and you pulled them apart, you would be looking at a side view of the brain. And there's a very striking resemblance between the limbic brain, the seat of the autonomic nervous system, and the Eye of Horus. And it's important for you to understand that this represents some type of inner vision. Pineal gland has been known to be called the third eye, because once it's stimulated and activated to the next level, it gives us profound inner vision. This is called Fibonacci's constant or the golden mean. If you were to follow that golden mean right around the circumference of the brain, it would wind up at the exact spot of where the pineal gland exists in the brain. And many different things in nature, from the universe to seashells, to the inner shape of a flower, all represent this golden mean pattern. Now, the pineal gland has a simple vein, artery, and nerve moving in, and a vein, artery, and nerve moving out, and it has a very rich and dense blood supply. The pineal gland is a neuroendocrine transducer secreting melatonin, responsible for the physiological circadian rhythm control. A new form of biomineralization has been studied in the human pineal gland. It consists of small crystals that are less than 20 microns in length. These crystals could be responsible for an electromechanical biological transduction mechanism in the pineal gland. And when you apply a mechanical stress and you begin to compress those crystals, the compression of those crystals begins to produce an external electromagnetic field, or begins to take one form of energy, mechanical stress, and turn it into another form of energy, an electrical charge. These are those rhombohedron crystals, and you have them in your pineal gland. In fact, many vertebrates have the same crystals in their pineal gland. Homing pigeons, as an example, have these tiny crystals, just like you and I, that are very sensitive to electromagnetic energy. And because the Earth has its own electromagnetic field, the pigeons can actually tune into the strongest signal, and they can navigate from one place to another place because they're sensitive to electromagnetism, and that's information they're picking up that's transcendent of their senses.